Hello and welcome to this International Conference on Men's Issues interview with your hosts, me, Elizabeth Hobson, leader of the political party Justice for Men and Boys and the Women Who Love Them, Brian Lee Martinez from Honey Badger Radio, and our guest, X-Man. X-Man is a young MRA in Chicago. He has written for A Voice for Men, and currently blogs at humanity87.home.blog. A link to that will be in the description. And he's a founding board member of the Ncfm Chicago chapter. Welcome, X-Man.
Thank you.
It's great to have you with us. So, do you want to tell us how you got into the men's human rights movement?
Yeah, it all sort of happened in a way. I remember it happened last year where I was bringing up men's issues on Twitter, and I continued to be called and labeled an MRA by some random trolls attacking my account. And I just decided to wonder, well, what's that? What's an MRA? Because people are going to keep calling. I might as well look it up and see what it is. And I realized there was an actual movement for that. And I was shocked because I was like, I wouldn't think that there would be an entire movement of people who write books and that there's a legal organization and all that. I was like, well, that I've been everywhere and I've done activism for a bunch of groups, and I've just like this has never came up ever in my entire life. So I just thought I was one person just in an entire isolated earth who talks about men's issues, and everybody else just didn't exist. So knowing that there's a community of men's issues, a community of people who talk about men's issues, I said, well, maybe I should join. Maybe I should do research on these people, and I should reach out to those people. And of course, who else did I find other than Elizabeth Hobson? So that's who connected me with Hannah Wallen, and Hannah Wallen told me about the ICMI, which happened to be in Chicago last year, which is where I'm from. And that's how I was able to join the ICMI, which led to me realizing that there's an Ncfm in Chicago, which is how I joined Ncfm. Just like one thing just led to the other.
Dominoes. Yeah. So, I mean, I wonder how you became aware of the men's issues you were talking about, because it took me personally finding MRAs to ever have my eyes and ears open to the fact that these issues exist.
Yeah, so because I was a big advocate for women's issues, and because I used to be a feminist, I assumed that feminism was simply just addressing women's issues. I assumed it stopped there, but just about addressing women's issues. And so I'm also an advocate for Black issues, and I saw stuff related to incarceration, about Black men and how the prison system incarcerates Black men. And so I was doing research, and it showed all demographics besides race. It started talking about class and other stuff, and then it brought up gender. And I never like connected that there was a gendered disparity in incarceration. I never like added up the dots. And I was thinking, like, if it's something as big as that's right in my face on a daily basis, and I don't add up the dots there, what else is there that I haven't thought about? You know, which is what led to me doing research and seeing other things related to male domestic violence, double standards about male domestic violence that when I was younger, and would laugh about with my friends, not realizing that there was an actual problem of victims used to be victims of domestic violence. And I just felt like disgusted almost with my society and ultimately with myself, because I used to play a role and stuff like that. I used to play a role in things that would hurt other men without even knowing that I was actually doing that.
Like what kinds of things, out of curiosity?
Yeah, so I was watching these TV shows and these movies, and it was just this constant humor about women's slapping or hitting their husbands in these sitcoms, and so we would always my friends and I would laugh about this, and then we would even make random jokes about a teacher hitting hitting a student, or we see a woman hitting a guy somewhere across the street, and we laugh about it and we would joke about it, not questioning whether or not that guy was in an abusive relationship, or whether that guy you know, was whether they were joking or whether it was an actual problem. We never even questioned that there might have been an actual problem with the domestic violence. And then there was this whole thing about, you know, gay marriage and all that. And it was a big, this argument about gay marriage. When I was younger, my parents or people in my family always have these negative views about gay marriage and about gay marriage and gay men and all that. And so I picked up all that when I was younger. But after a while, I slowly, you know, would question, like, should gay men be restricted from being allowed to be married, or should they be allowed to be married since it's their own life and not ours? You know, maybe we shouldn't be restricting other people's lives. Maybe that should be their own thing. And I was getting almost like backlash from people in my own circle, even suggesting that originally.
Mm-hmm.
You know, fast forward 10 years later, now everybody pretends like they're always on board with it. Right? Even people who I used to know, you know, almost nobody acts homophobic, so it's like, oh, it's a bunch of fake people. Right? But but yeah.
All right. Elizabeth?
Yeah. You mentioned you called yourself a feminist. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Before knowing the whole, you know, history of feminism. Yes.
Yeah, yeah. And, you know, so you said you thought it was about women's issues. Were there any kind of issues that you felt were particularly important? Were there any particular kind of feminists or feminist ideas that you thought, you know, had some legitimacy back then?
Well, yeah, I mean, I still do sometimes address women's issues to this day. I mean, it's stuff related to sexual assault and sexual violence. But I still do feel uncomfortable about stuff like that today. Like when when I'm walking around with my friends or I'm in a workplace, and, you know, sometimes people make a lot of, you know, weird comments and sometimes do things that's uncomfortable to watch. You know, watch people, you know, sometimes, you know, do things without questioning whether or not they can touch this person. You know, I see a lot of people do that, and a lot of women in my workplace go through that, and it just looks uncomfortable to watch. That was one of the main things that always caught my attention. You know, and I was also I used to go to meetings related to female entrepreneurship. So women who used to start their own businesses. It was basic stuff like that. You know, I never actually questioned, you know, what exactly the feminist movement is, you know, historically, what their philosophy is. I just assumed, you know, this is a women's group, so this is a group about women's issues. And I just assumed that it stopped there. I never thought about men's issues, nor did I think that the feminist movement would be actually advocating and protesting a push for it. I mean, likely, yeah. Yeah.
So what are your conclusions about feminism at this point?
Well, usually when people ask me, I don't usually waste time. I just say that they're garbage people. But I don't know. I mean, so my point is always is that what feminists do, what they perfect is the art of willful ignorance, which is the difference between complete naivety. Naivety, you know, is somebody not being aware that something's wrong, and if you just tell them that something's wrong, they'll understand and they'll start slowly changing their views. But feminists are willfully ignorant. They claim up and down that there's a problem, that men's issues don't exist. And you start telling them that men's issues exist, and they're like, they suddenly gain knowledge of men's issues and say, oh, well, if men's issues exist, why don't men fix it? It's men's fault that this happened. And you say, okay, well, then you have groups and organizations that try to push for it to be changed, and then they protest those groups and slander those groups. And it's like, it's not really that they think this is the case, it's that they want that to be the case. It's an interest. It's all about interest. There's an interest in not knowing what's going on. It's an interest in believing that these men hate women, or that it's a conspiracy theory, because now that justifies every bad thing that we do to you.
Mm-hmm. And do you want to tell us a little bit about your work with Ncfm Chicago?
Yeah, I mean, it's not much. It's not much at the moment. You know, what we originally did, we went to see a circumcision documentary. We took some pictures and put it on our Facebook page. And we also went on weekends, if we didn't have any current events, we would just plan and we would go to a homeless. There's this homeless shelter where they serve food to the homeless.
A shelter?
Yeah, it's dominated by a lot of males. It's pretty pretty male dominated. So we go to those shelters and give, you know, and serve food to the homeless. And we had planned to go like set events where we can do screenings of films like The Red Pill and maybe other films. We planned on setting up screenings, but once the whole pandemic happened, all that just got stopped.
Mm-hmm.
That and the Illinois Fathers' Rights Movement. I don't know if I brought that up. I was a member of the Illinois Fathers' Rights Movement as well. It was also being
No, I didn't know about that.
Yeah, that's also being put on hold.
Yeah, it seems like you, even before discovering the MRM, you had an interest in human rights causes. Is there any reason why that was of particular interest to you, you know, considering how young you are and everything? Did you, like, was that something common amongst your peers? Is it just the way you were raised? Like, where do you believe that might come from?
I honestly don't know where it would come from personally, but I just know, like, the thing that interests me, I always had this belief. I've always, after seeing people, like, I've seen people, you know, die at young ages from certain unnecessary diseases. I've seen people, you know, die of old age, and I would just watch these TV shows and these movies, and it always end with somebody, you know, as they get older, they're always questioned, like, did they make the most out of their life? Or, you know, people always sit back and say, well, I could have done so much more with my life. Instead, I didn't do anything. And for me, it's always about, you know, making life worth it, living life for what it is, because you're gonna die eventually. You're gonna, you know. So for me, it's always about, you know, at least if I die, I want to die saying that I accomplished something, or that I tried my best to accomplish something.
Good man.
Yeah.
What a great answer. And so what about I know we've spoken before, me and you, about, you know, how men and women are raised in the modern world, you know, what expectations and there are on men and women, and what is acceptable for men and women. What do you think about, you know, our current society in terms of the expectations and the behavior we accept from men and women?
Good question. Well, from what I know, I think the problem is that in society we have a series of expectations. We expect men, you know, to be a certain way. We expect women to be a certain way, and ultimately the ideal point would be that both men and women should decide whether or not they want to live in this reality. So it's not like they should reject these traditional roles, but they should decide whether or not they want to be in this traditional role or not. You know, so they're, you know, and unfortunately, men are not granted this option. They're just not granted the option of whether or not they want to decide. You know, if society will, even society that tells men that they should reject these gender roles, get upset when they actually do. And so it's like a moment there, there's no reality where somebody's gonna allow. I remember there was this tragedy where a guy shot. He came in and shot up a school, a bunch of women. He had an issue with women. He was probably mentally unstable, and they were complaining that none of the boys in that room did anything to stop the shooter. But the problem is that the guys could have died if they tried to stop the shooter. They like their life. Why would they immediately just pop up to help? But they were just expecting immediately that those boys should have helped. And especially in a society that claims that we're trying to get rid of traditional gender roles, all it takes is an act of violence, an act of danger, an act of anything, and then society just gets angry that men aren't stepping up.
Yeah, I remember that story. That was, I mean, I thought it was despicable because there were quite a few outlets who took the same position. So this guy had kind of gone into the classroom, divided the kids into boys and girls, and said, right, boys, you leave or you're going to get shot. So they left. you know, and it's like, I mean, isn't the advice that when someone's got a gun and they tell you to do something, you just do it? You know, if they want your handbag or your, you know, laptop or your watch or whatever, give it to them. Like, you know, don't be a hero is what they kind of, you know, is that not the advice? That's what I would want for my son. I'd kind of rather he was alive than, or either of them were alive than heroes personally.
That's one of the reasons I call my website Humanity, because I feel like when society treats men like they're not humans. When they say they want everyone to evacuate society, they're probably talking about they want women to just address whatever the shooter asks them to do. And they're like, well, those guys aren't humans. They can risk being shot.
Yeah.
So
that also kind of lends to your point about gender roles. You say that people should be able to choose to live however they like, but it seems that I'm going to try and reiterate your point the way that I might say it, and then you let me know if it lines up so I'm not putting words in your mouth. It would seem that through the feminist movement from like the 60s, one of the goals was to sort of to liberate women from a gender role, from an expectation that they have to be, you know, housewives and mothers and homemakers and all of that. And the idea sounded good. However, they never did the same for men. And so in the current day, women can essentially choose to stay at home and raise children, choose to have a career, choose to figure out how to balance both of those things, choose not to have a family, have no kids at all, whatever, be married, be not married, it doesn't really matter. But men still are expected to be protectors and providers, even if they aren't married, even if they aren't straight, even if they have no interest in women, even if they don't want to be involved with women, like MGTOW. They get shamed because they're not abiding by that gender role. And that enforcement doesn't come from men. That enforcement, that expectation, it comes from everyone, but in particular, it comes from women.
Yeah, that pretty much sums it up. And that also goes back to I wrote an article about feminism in the 60s and 70s. I called it the feminist chameleon. I went into detail about how feminists they kind of changed their philosophy or changed their rhetoric depending on the environment of the conversation. You know, because I pointed out, because I've had this conversation with feminists in the past where they originally tried to mimic the rhetoric of the civil rights movement on the basis of race, about racial equality, being in favor of whites and against the black community. And they tried to pretend like, well, women are the same, like gender equality is the same. Everything's in favor of men and against women. So there can't be a men's movement because men have everything. You know, but if you start telling them and addressing that there are actual legal and social and educational and media double standards for men and women, that things that actually hurt, harm, and disadvantage men, they suddenly do a complete 180, which is more of what's going on in modern feminism now, where you do a complete 180 and claim, well, the patriarchy hurts men too, and it hurts both genders, and feminism is trying to help. But if the patriarchy hurts men too, why is it that I have to explain to you that men's issues exist in the first place? If feminists are trying to help, how do they help by pretending like everything's in favor of men and against women? These arguments they're two contradictory things, yet they'll say it so casually in the middle of a conversation as if they're saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yes, it's quite awesome to behold.
Yeah. So what kind of goals do you want? Like, what do you want to see with your work with NCFM, which, by the way, for anybody who doesn't know, it stands for the National Coalition for Men, NCFM, and your blog, and just in general, like, what do you want to see? And you know, I say this as a fellow Chicagoan. I'm born and raised in Chicago. I left the city, but it will always be home for me. And I know that it is a kind of desert when it comes to men's rights. Like, there just isn't much of a presence there, and there really needs to be, because I think that one of the reasons why Chicago has so many problems with criminality, with gang violence, with, you know, all of the issues, I think a lot of it stems from the way in which men are viewed in our society, and it just leads to a ton of other problems. But what kind of stuff would you like to see? What would make you happy on your deathbed? Does it make you say, you know what, I think I did well. I think I made a difference, and I have no regrets.
Yeah, for me, well, in an ideal world, for me, I would say it kind of goes back to my I think when I did research on race, I realized that a lot of politicians have been in office for about 50 or 60 years in more of the House and the Senate and stuff like that. And if you look at their views around the 60s and the 70s, they had some pretty disturbing views on race. You know, some of them were even part of the Klan. Some literally sitting members of government were actually part of the Klan at one point. And so they were advocating against civil rights. They were advocating against integration. They were making a lot of weird statements. But over time, like 20-something years after that, like the culture had changed so much that they actually had to backtrack everything they were saying because their previous history was coming back to light, and their previous history of voting was coming back to light. They had to backtrack and apologize about that, and back up their statements. And now it's so common where if you're a student or you're any natural person and you see something, you hear new things about the racist stuff that used to go on in the past, you look and you say, well, what the hell were those people's problems? What the hell is wrong with those people? And I think that's the kind of reality I'm looking for, that somewhere 20, 30 years in the future, you'll see all these politicians and all these media members and public faces who are talking trash about men's issues. They have to backtrack and have to try to backtrack their statements because they realize there's a complete change of culture. And then other people will just look at that history and say, what the hell was wrong with those people? That's the kind of goal I think of.
I'm so with you. I'm just looking to see if I can find a quote that I really like. I'll just paraphrase it. So in my very first ever public speaking engagement, it was a debate at a Bath University, and it was called "The House Says Feminism is Outdated." And my opening statement, I ended with a quote from John Stuart Mill's "The Subjection of Women." And it's something like, "One must not suppose that the barbarisms to which men cling to longest be less barbarisms than those they earlier discard." And, that's sort of really sums up for me what you're saying, and also what I want. I do, want us to look back and think, what a barbarous time, man.
Yeah.
And I think, because our gynocentrism is hardwired, and, it's got that evolutionary psychology kind of foundation, it truly is kind of barbarism. It's so ingrained and archaic, and we're so over it, and I hope we are moving past it. I mean, so that's what you hope for. Have you got faith that it's coming?
That's something I never actually thought about. I don't know. Sometimes I just completely lose faith, depending on how stuff goes. But I've always I've been slightly critical of things that the men's rights movement, how they went about fixing certain things, or how they went about fixing things lately versus what they were doing back then. I think that plays a role in my skepticism of a changing culture. And it's also just the point where I've pointed out that women seem to have this big problem with self-reflection when it comes down to gender equality or men's issues. They have this big issue with like self-reflecting on how they play a role in an issue. It's like that. It's almost as if there's always this immediate like response, be it educational, or be it a snarky, or just be it a desperate shaming tactic. There's always something other than
a defense mechanism.
there's anything other than I'm wrong. It's always, well, even if I'm wrong, I'm still technically right because of this technicality. And there's, I feel like that's a big pervasive thing. And I've always said that the thing my writing is supposed to do is to hold the mirror in front of people's face. It just, I'm not gonna really try to sit there and convince somebody or sway somebody to my side. I'm just gonna here are the facts. I'm just gonna point it on this website, and I'm just gonna ask you to read it. I'm just gonna keep pointing it in their face until it hammers home. And that's kind of what I did on my Twitter, which is how I was kicking all feminists' ass on on Twitter, before they false flagged me off of Twitter. But yeah, there was a lot of popular feminists, and they would try to harass my account. And at the beginning, it would work, but I slowly, once I started like recognizing what their arguments were, what are the patterns of their argument, I utilized that to come up with a counter argument to what they were saying. I utilize that to, and I also do that for my writing. Like, what are the main arguments they're trying to use against why we shouldn't have a men's rights movement? What are the main arguments that they're trying to use against what men need to do better? Then I write that down, and I either argue it, or if I find it legitimate, if I find it to be slightly legitimate, I'll address it inside of my writing, so that so I'm keeping my side of the street clean. So there's nothing you can do to use against me or my group.
Good approach. Very good approach. And I noticed you said, you've got some criticisms of some men's rights movement or MRA approaches. In what ways do you think we can improve our game? In mind, that you are a young man, and we need to reach young men.
Yeah.
So your input on that question is quite vital.
Yeah. As I pointed, what the men's rights movement did prior, which it was really important, because it's why the men's rights movement had a ground to begin with. What the men's rights movement originally did, was that they would address. I sort of addressed it in my last point. Is they would address topics that people were trying to use against them, and they would make sure that people couldn't use it against them. I realized people were complaining that men don't speak up, and so that's why when you have somebody like Warren Farrell who writes books and goes to speeches, people can't say men aren't speaking up, because here are men speaking up. Here are the conferences that we're holding. Here are the speeches that they're holding, and here they are being attacked for doing the very thing people tell them to do. They say the problem is that if men have a problem, why don't they go fix it? Why don't they go change the society? Well, we do. Well, we have a legal organization, and we have a political party, the Justice for Men and Boys, and we have the Ncfm. We're trying to pass laws, and we're trying to stick to the, we're trying to pass laws and get the government to change laws that would help males. At some point, I'm not sure, somewhere in the early 2000s, this approach sort of stopped, where it looks like we're not really addressing, criticism that can be used against us as much. Because a big thing that's now being used is that they're trying to claim that we're just the white male movement, or that they're trying to connect us to the alt-right somehow. I mean, that's stupid. I mean, it sounds silly, but there are journals out there to actually try to connect us to the alt-right. So, but you also utilize race as an example, as a reasoning why we can be connected to the alt-right. So as I always point out, I bring up Black men's issues at times, sometimes on my blog, or I talk about it to some of the MRM members, because that it makes it harder. It makes it harder for them to say, that we don't care about Black men, or that we're not addressing Black men's issues. And I know that because that's what I did when I was writing for Voice of Men, and I made a whole article about Black men, and a feminist would say, or I found some pieces or some YouTube channels or some MRA, and they said something relevant to Black men's issues, and they would say we don't talk about Black men's issues or address it, and I would point this out to them, and then they would get upset, or they would or they would try to block me, or they would run off. And I realized that that's kind of the point. You have to address, if there's something slightly legitimate, you have to address that, because they're going to look for any weakness, and they're going to try to use that against you as much as possible. I feel like the MRM hasn't necessarily addressed the whole racial, the whole race dynamic going on in the MRM at the moment. Is that in the fact that I pointed out that the MRM seems to have this new approach to how to address feminism, and it's kind of more so of like trying to find common ground with feminists. I appreciate that. I appreciate the effort of finding common ground with people, but as I pointed out, the problem with feminism isn't radical feminists. If you take radical feminists out of feminism, there would still be a large problem. The problem is philosophy, purely philosophy. You know, they have to change their philosophy. You know, it can't really just be this feminist is nice to me, so maybe that'll help. It has to be a complete philosophical change, you know, and if feminists would be willing to compromise that.
Yeah, but if they change their philosophy, it would actually unravel feminism itself, because at the root of it, there's like the central premise that men have oppressed women all throughout history at the expense of women and to the benefit of men. And that would be the most important thing to change. And if they change it, then that would just undo everything. And of course, you know, there is a difference between women and men who call themselves feminists and people whose job is to be a feminist. And the people whose job it is to be a feminist, their main interest is maintaining a need for their expertise, which means feminism can never be done. It has to always have new battles to fight. It always has to. And the MRM is just another target. I mean, they've tried to attack the men's rights movement for many, many, many decades. And Warren Farrell, regardless of how much he extends an olive branch and how nice he is and tries to work with them, because they need an enemy. And so they call us, or they equate the men's movement with white nationalism or the alt-right or the far right or whatever, because it just so happens to be the latest boogeyman in the news in general. And they just want to connect that to the men's movement because they're just trying to get us by extension. You know, when, and I know that this, I don't want to belabor this too much, but when Roy Den Hollander murdered Mark Angelucci, the media jumped on it to show essentially that Roy Den Hollander was typical of the men's movement and Mark Angelucci was the exception to the men's movement. And it's like you can fight these battles, and I get what you're saying, but at the end of the day, feminism has made its mission to take down any competition, especially competitions that threatens their central narrative, and they will use whatever weapons they can. And we should, you know, be prepared for those narrative battles. I'm with you. I talk about the racial aspects as well, because I'm, you know, I hate saying that because I'm non-white, people listen. But there is some truth to it, even though I despise that my ideas are taken more seriously because of my skin color. But I think that men's rights is about men no matter what color, and feminists and other sort of social constructivists, cultural Marxists, etc., that try to attack men's rights activists by calling them racist or implying or suggesting that they're racist. They're just trying to figure out how to divide us by basically saying, look, these men's groups don't care about black men, or these men's groups don't care about brown men. But the truth is, that's just not the case. And I think that we all know that. But I take your point. I mean, we could be more vocal. We just want to be careful not to end up playing their game of racial division, because that's what they do. And I think that we should always have a unifying message when it comes to addressing men, that it doesn't matter if you're homeless or rich or powerful or powerless or black or white or brown or even a male feminist. I've defended male feminists. I have defended male SJWs. I have defended male communists, because if I think they're being unfairly treated, I don't care if they hate me for it, I'm going to defend them as well. And I think that that's probably the best thing an MRA can do, and be as vocal as they can while doing it.
Yeah, and to address two of your points, the point about violence, I just want to remind people, because most people think of, and I write articles about this, there are actual, the belief that feminists are in fear or concern of violence is a complete myth, because if they were, they wouldn't be feminists, because feminists have a long history of actual violence. There's a feminist who actually tried to bomb churches as early as 1800s, tried to bomb churches. There's feminist terrorists who actually identified as terrorists and tried to, bomb government buildings. So they're definitely not in fear of violence. And even if they can't find an MRA who actually does violence, they will just make shit up. Clearly, I mean, the Elliot Rodgers situation shows that. I mean, if they can't find a self-identified MRA doing anything violence, they'll just make it up. They'll just say Elliot Rodgers is an MRA because
they'll say. Yep, they'll say Dylan Roof is an MRA. They'll say Alec Manassian was an MRA. Yeah, they'll just make it up.
Well, I mean, they said that Roy Den Hollander was one, and he, had on his website sort of very clear criticism and vitriol against the men's human rights movement. He hated MRAs by, his own word, but that wasn't convenient, so they just ignored it.
Yeah. And as far as the race thing, I mean, you and I are on the same page, right? I hate it too, but unfortunately, the thing about black men is I don't know how long we have, but unfortunately, we're sort of a necessary evil for society. Unfortunately, that's what we're seen as when it comes down to activism. The only reason black men can talk about their issues dramatically is because they can do it under the guise of racism, of bringing up that racism exists. So the only reason they allow black men to bring up the issues black men talk about is because they can argue that it's just racism, it has nothing to do with gender. But of course, that doesn't make sense, because if it didn't have anything to do with gender, it would be hurting black men and women at the same rates.
Sure. But there is the danger in that, because it's true. A black man, a black activist can bring up the unique ways in which black men are impacted. And then because they're discussing it in a racial context, you'll get people to pay attention. But unless you also include the fact that the gender aspect is actually more relevant than the racial one, i.e. white men are going to deal with more of the issues that black men deal with than black women are, because the actual gender aspect is more impactful. Unless you do that, what's going to happen is feminists will co-opt the suffering of black men and turn it into the suffering of black people, erasing the men, and then in turn turn it into the suffering of black women in particular, which they do. It's what Black Lives Matter is founded on in terms of its ideology. It's what you will find in any space that is essentially like an activist space for blacks. It puts black men at the bottom of its own hierarchy because they are oppressors, even though they are the ones dying and suffering from, substance addiction, and they're far more likely to experience violence and far more likely to go to jail and all these other issues. But because feminism always has to maintain women have it worse and black women have it worst of all, then black men will never be seen truly as men in need, because if they are, then you have to see them as men. And if you have to see them as men, well, then you have to look at all men as men. And this is the last thing, the absolute last thing that the feminist movement wants. And not just the feminist movement, but the state in general. But that's a whole other conversation.
And that goes back to my point. As I say, I don't know how long we have, because as you point out, you pretty much already have done that. And back then, the way we were allowed to get one of the ways we were allowed to get away with it, other than portraying it as racism, was by calling out white women. Because if white women have, especially in the 60s and 70s, they had this weird reality where they started trying to portray themselves as an oppressed minority, even though they're the majority of the population.
They still do.
Yeah, and oppressed minority. It's only slightly being called out. I know there was a Bill Burr did a slight thing on it at Saturday Night Live recently, just like skit about that. Right, but so there was a thing back then where we could do that, but now the feminist movement is now trying to use intersectional feminists to now get black and women and Hispanic women on board with their group. So now it looks like all women. Now it can look like all women are part of the movement and all that. So now, and I just don't know how long black men have, because it looks like it's almost like we run a time. We run a time schedule of how long we were able to bring this up, because now, and we see with Kamala Harris, they're now trying to use Kamala Harris as a black woman to explain it, and they're trying to say that any criticism, the fact that black men are criticizing her for her incarceration policies, is really a deep-seated hatred against black women. So now black men can't even criticize, Yeah, so it's like it looks like they realized that the racial situation. So now they're putting black women in their face, in everybody's face. So now we can't. Now they definitely can't be criticized because now, well, that's misogyny against black women.
Sure,
Apparently.
even though Kamala Harris isn't black.
Not even. Yeah, she's not even. Yeah.
I mean, she's part black, but not really. She's more Indian. But yeah, I take your point. I'm just saying it's tough. Like you should just remain vigilant. I think the race card has limited usage. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's also, I think, important to be honest, just as a rule. And, the fact is that, with regards to incarceration rates, with regards to being denied access to children, all kinds of sort of disadvantages are disproportionately affecting black men. And I don't think that there's much utility in trying to ignore that. I think, the way that the sort of Marxist Black Lives Matter movement has blown up, that's because there's a grain of truth in, the idea that black people are disproportionately kind of affected by some issues. And, like you say, that's largely black men, not black women, if we're completely honest. I mean, with regards to being treated harshly or even violently in the criminal justice system by the police, come on now.
Yep.
You know who that's happening to. And so, I do think that these are issues that we should address out of honesty, and because if we are not seen to address real issues that are going on, then we are leaving people vulnerable to go to the only people who are addressing them, who are absolute crazy radicals.
I just want to make sure I clarify as well. Like, make sure one thing: rule always never go full SJW. Let's make sure that's a rule that I always.
No, I don't think it's possible.
Right. So we're not gonna go. Right. We're not gonna go full blown SJW. We're not gonna start having. We're not gonna replace Warren Farrell because he's not a black man. Like that's some stupid. That's some stupid SJW nonsense that's going on. Right. And that's in fact a mockery of actual activism. So I actually get annoyed when I see stuff like that. I see them saying, let's put black people in movies that white people are in. They can't make black characters. They can't make diverse black characters. Gotta replace them with. That's a bunch of that stuff like that is a bunch of nonsense. Right.
It should be seen as insulting.
Yeah. But my only point is there was this guy. I'm trying to remember what this guy's name was. But he used to write for Voice for Men, right? I'm trying to remember. He used to write for Voice for Men. I think he wrote some good things about men's issues, but they found out his social media activity was very unusual. He had some very disturbing views on race segregation. And so he got removed. The Voice for Men did the right thing. They did remove him from that thing. And about a year, he started getting upset at the MRM and saying that it was taken over. It was being taken over, and that he doesn't feel he can express his views correctly. Then about a year or so later, he was involved in the Charlottesville Unite the Right rally.
Andrew Anglin?
No.
No. I think the crying Nazi. I think he wrote for AVFM for a brief stint. Yeah.
Right. So the point I always point out is that, like, a guy with that viewpoint, why did he feel comfortable writing for Voice for Men? Just, knowing, why did he feel comfortable writing for Voice for Men? Why do you think a Voice for Men was a place that he could fit into? And I think the problem is that there wasn't a cutoff. There wasn't a cutoff point, and unfortunately we live in a society where you have to literally let people know that there's a line of stuff that's tolerated, and if you don't tell them that line on race, some people will just generally think that they can say just about anything. It's crazy, but it is what it is. I mean, I've been everywhere. I've seen it on stuff, even stuff related to sports. People end up making some some disturbing statements, you know, in the middle of a sports debate because they you know, nobody told them there was a line. And I'm just like making sure like we clarify that we do actually address Black men's issues, and we're not, you know, we're not advocating for any type of like, you know, segregation. We're not doing any reactionary segregationist like policies, any Klan, you know, any stuff like that. Because if we address black men, then people who have those disturbing views on race will know that this is not a place for them to be a part of. You know, they'll know to stay at whatever place they're at. But that's just the kind of point I was making. I was making sure we make that distinction, that we're not going to go full blown SJW, but we still do our open, you know, we still do address Black men, and we don't have any of those disturbing views on race. You know what I'm saying? If that makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, I think that is a pretty good place to wrap up. Are there any closing messages for the ICMI audience?
Wow, I totally forgot this was an ICMI event because I was getting all wrapped up in my talks. I totally forgot where I was at. I would just say, you know, like I wanted to think of something like witty, but I I have nothing witty to say at all.
Give you a minute and put it in.
Yeah, well, for me, I always stay true to myself. You know, I tell people my rule is that I write to the world, not for the world. You know, if people, you know, some people don't like, you know, what they want to hear, they can always, you know, go somewhere else where they and find a place what they do like to hear. You know, what they do like to read. I think it's frankly ridiculous that we live in a society that thinks that they could basically treat men any type of way. They can ignore their issues. They can downplay their pain. They can dismiss any type of push for any of those things to address, and then somehow assume that men are still going to be okay. Still assume that we'll just be able to walk through life like a natural human. When reality is telling us that we're not a human. It's just frankly ridiculous, and I think men will know when we reach true equality, when we actually feel like we're being treated like humans. That's my closing statement.
That's a great message. Well, thank you both, gentlemen, for joining me, and thanks to everybody for watching. Check out X-Man's blog, link is in the description, and enjoy the next video.